Cafe Cabaret. And incidentally, this just happens to be part 8 of the 10-part series on comedy in the American tradition, presented by the wrong hero. And this chapter is called Sketch. No relation to Sketch Henderson, the Johnny Carson sidekick. It is brought to you by the wrong hero and produced by Francis DiMenno, who bears more than a faint resemblance to the wrong hero. Greetings! It's your old pal Hero once again, and this segment, of course, is called Sketch. But before we get into the section which will herein be called Sketch, which is part 8 of our monumental 10-part series on humor and comedy in the American tradition, I would like to conclude some business that I wasn't able to conclude last week with the words of Arthur Miller on Stagecraft, which do have a little something to do with both sketch humor and the humorous essay. Arthur Miller stated that as a writer, writing a play was the only way he knew to fight back. He stated, "The whole idea of society is deeply impregnated in my plays. It's the same with the Greeks. They couldn't conceive of the individual apart from the city-state." He goes on to say, "The real question is whether the American artist is to be alienated from his government or be encouraged by it to express the nature and genius of his people." And he goes on still further to state that the paranoid streak is just below the surface in the world. Audiences recognize it in a play. When theater is memorable, it has a strong civic side. For most of history, theater was involved with the fate of the kingdom and the importance of power. It's essential to the Greeks, who regarded people who were non-political as idiots. And the final word from Arthur Miller is that if you live long enough, it all seems like a comedy. Well, that's very true. And in this section, I hope to treat certain aspects of the humorous essay as well as sketch humor. One would expect art to appeal to minds equipped chiefly to appreciate novelty rather than complexity, but that is far from the case. Things have a life of their own. It's simply a matter of waking their souls. Max Beerbohm is responsible for a genre which he invented himself. The tale which is part parody, part exquisitely humorous sketch, and part psychological study. An example is Max Beerbohm's parody of Henry James called The Moat in the Middle Distance. Now, this is about Don Imus, and it states that Don Imus gets to viciously attack people we must be nice to. And to a certain degree, that's the essence of invective, but it's also, to a certain degree, the essence of the humorous essay, that one treats of matters which aren't generally spoken of in polite conversation. Show me a man who talks like an essayist, and I will show you an essayist, whether in fact he applies that as his trade or nay. People like someone who stands for something, left or right. They'll give you the benefit of the doubt if they think you're coming from the gut. Now, Michel Shee debunks the repository of humor for the past 45 years, none other than Mad Magazine, as harmlessly childish jokes, as offensive as a whoopee cushion. Philip Hamburger attacks that other citadel, the New Yorker, and states that its magical mix of fact, fiction, wit, art, and comment, but mostly by its intellectual honesty, civilized skepticism, and gentle irreverence. Sounds to me like a formula for a snooze-a-thon, but old Phil Hamburger sure knows somebody he needs to be nice to on the New Yorker. Stephen Canfor said of Will Rogers, "Will Rogers was an ingratiating family man with considerable, if calculating Anyway, these random notes are more or less just notes towards attacking this topic of the essay and the different styles in which one may essay to write them. As a matter of fact, essay is the French word for attempt, according to Gore Vidal and my French teacher. And so if I essay to discuss the essay, I attempt to discuss an attempt. For a quarter of a century, beginning in 1910, Will Rogers was widely and wildly popular as a performer on stage, screen, radio, and in print, despite his always striking the same pseudo-philosophical, down-home, platitudinous pose, says Josh Greenfield. And that, of course, is what passes for the comic essay these days. Garrison Keillor, although he's done a great many things that I suspect he has no reason to be ashamed of, it's that same Will Rogers pseudo-philosophical, down-home, platitudinous pose. William F. Buckley stated, "To prove that something is boring can be very exciting." Doing this, by the way, was one of H.L. Mencken's specialties, also Mark Twain's. Certainly one of Mencken's specialties. His essay on the Rotarians is hilarious, as is his essay on the speeches of Warren G. Harding. And Mark Twain, of course, wrote the essay, The Literary Offenses of James Fenimore Cooper, which, for anybody who's ever read any of James Fenimore Cooper, is, in fact, quite hilarious. It is impossible to progress without a whip, says Trotsky. Although not necessarily known primarily as an essayist, there is something of the comic essayist's philosophy in these words by Trotsky. After examining them carefully, nail your judgments to the door, says Emerson, himself no slouch in the essay writing department. Up-to-dateness is invariably ahead of its time, says Paul Berman. And that leads to an interesting point. If you exercise your mind and constantly remain well informed, insofar as it is in your ability to do so, you will find that you will be ahead of the curve rather than just keeping up with it. Because the way things happen don't come from out of nowhere. They develop from ongoing situations. If you're afraid of going too far, you won't go far enough, says some anonymous soul, who I wish I could cite the name of. Walter Goodman talks of Calvin Trillin, known perhaps mostly for his poetry in the New Yorker, but also for his poetry in the Nation, but also his humorous essays. Trillin finds the fascination in stories that sound as though they begin as items in local newspapers, another technique also employed by Dave Barry. With a sharp and tolerant eye, a lot of old-fashioned reporting, and a controlled, clear, amiable style, he opens up characters and digs into actions, telling a good tale along the way. Phoebe Pettengill speaks of the poet James Merrill and states, Merrill shows that naive misunderstandings may well ripen into the revelation that spurs the writer to create. How many times have you mistaken something that somebody has said and repeated it back to them in a mistaken form and found this to be much more humorous and in an odd way more to the point of what the person was saying than what he actually said? James Thurber doesn't have very many kind words to say about Will Rogers. As a matter of fact, he opines that Will Rogers was the bosom friend of senators and congressmen, who was about as daring as an early Shirley Temple movie. Whereas Philip Klass states, even for those who love him and treasure his wit, H.L. Mencken can be the most infuriating combination of La Rochefoucauld, Dr. Johnson, and Walter Winchell. Walter Winchell, indeed. Well, I think I will take a break here and resume this presentation at some other time. I will not stand for this blatant attack on my hero, H.L. Mencken, W.H. Mencken, whatever his name is. You can tell probably that I am in fact all talked out because I did last week's show and I'm starting this week's show, but I only have 29 minutes to make dinner. So anyway, I'm going and I'll be back. So don't go away because there's more. In Chapter 8 of The Wrong Hero, History of American Comedy. Well, howdy doody, arrivederci, and all them other groovy things. I'm the wrong hero, and I'm back with more notes on the art of sketch comedy and the comic essay. Ironically enough, this section on sketch, or called sketch, is the sketchiest of the sections that I have gone through enormous difficulty and inconvenience to prepare for your behalf. Let's see now. Well, yes. Where was I? I want you for my wife. Yeah. Let's see now. What is this? D. McD, huh? Wonder who D. McD is. Who are they talking about exactly? Well, S.J. Perelman, another one of my personal heroes, and certainly somebody who belongs in that pantheon of great essayists in general and great comic essayists in particular. He called himself a philanthropist, which is a writer of short, amusing sketch-type essays. S.J. Perelman stated that writing takes audacity and exuberance and gaiety, and the most important one is audacity. Damn straight. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, say. And see if I can remember who D. McD was. Well, whoever he is, he transcends the lowbrow topic with satiric artistry. He creates high comedy. He has a gift for parody and apposite quotation, a knack for knitting together diverse information, an ability to come up with rubrics to crystallize old quarrels and resolve new ones. In his written voice, outsized and approachable, playful and serious, spontaneous and disciplined. Now, some of these things can be said about Perelman, specifically that he transcends the lowbrow topic with satiric artistry. I believe he wrote an essay called Somewhere a Roscoe, which is still a classic of its genre, and in it all he did was take a detective story from Spicy Detective Stories issue of 1936 and provide a running monologue to its to quotes taken from it. Such was his artistry that that story lives on, only because he commented on it. A gift for parody and apposite quotation, a knack for knitting together diverse information. That's very important. There is such a thing as knowing too much and failing to see the forest for the trees, but on the other hand, to a certain degree, there is no such thing as knowing of too many things. Having at least a smattering of knowledge which enables you to draw conclusions, make comparisons, reach inferences. A knack for knitting together diverse information. You need information in order to utilize imagination. And an ability to come up with rubrics to crystallize old quarrels and resolve new ones. Well, of course, Mark Twain was the master of this when he would say something like, cauliflower is just cabbage with a college education. That was one example of that phenomenon. The Columbia Journalism Review gives this advice to journalists, but it's equally applicable to the writer of the comic essay. One should tell stories, find an unusual angle, do historical research, try a fly-on-the-wall approach, choose something or someone interesting to write about. In the case case of the stand-up comedian, that someone might very well turn out to be himself or herself, but nevertheless, tell stories. That is key. 3 prose virtues, according to Somerset Maugham, are lucidity, simplicity, and euphony. Lucidity, literally, it means sort of transparency, but also clearness. When they say that you're not lucid, what they mean is that you're not speaking clearly and making intelligent sense. Simplicity, that means stripping things down to their barest of essentials before deciding whether to rebuild on that framework. It's just like you got to strip off all the old paint before you can put the new paint on. And of course, euphony. Euphony meaning beautiful sounds. And certainly euphony can go a long way, but it's the most subtle of these 3 tools. Now, Richard Jenkins talks about Robert Louis Stevenson, and he states that Stevenson's early writings have not worn well. That arch, self-conscious manner that is the bane of the 19th century essay is all too visible. And of course, that's true of many early writings by writers, especially those who were taught in the old school. Robert Graves called it the cobblestone style bits and pieces of other styles. And of course, when one is younger, the temptation is almost irresistible if one is in love with words to attempt to incorporate some of the better bits of other writers into one's own writing, since one has not yet developed a technique whereby one can come up with those sorts of things on one's own head of steam. However, it's an ongoing process. One never stops learning, and you only get better and better, although some people get worse and worse, and there's no explaining why or how this happens. Many of Mark Lehner's stories, says M.G. Lord, seem to have been written according to this formula. To achieve humor, insert outrageous nouns into a traditional story, the formula used in Mad Libs. Well, that's certainly not the type of comic essay that we hope to discuss here today. It's more or less an example of the essay that we wish not to discuss. However, do keep in mind that a useful technique in coming up with your merry quips and japes and jests is to take a word that sounds similar to the word that is commonly used and see how that changes things, like the war on poetry or the war on poverty. Poetry readings or poverty readings. All that glitters is not gold, all that glitters is not good, all that glitters is not God. And I think you get the gist. The successful essayist needs to combine passion and contemplation and to fuse them into artistic form, a perfect alignment and enlightenment and perception, says Elizabeth Young. And I think she's right. Now, Irma Bombeck, of all people, speaks of the motivation for the sort of person who does what she does, which is to write a syndicated humor column for newspapers. If you can't make it better, you can laugh at it. Of course, some people would say, you can make it better by laughing at it, or you can laugh at it, and that makes it seem better. But Irma Bombeck is no flaming radical. She comes right out and says that there are things that you can't make better, but at the very least, if you can't make them better, you can laugh at them. Not necessarily cause people to laugh at them or find them humorous or motivate them to change them. Irma Bombeck's ambition is not that. It is basically to state, if you can't make it better, you can laugh at it. Well, American comic essays, at least the contemporary types, have been sort sort of broken down into four categories. And there was an earlier breaking down of American categories in the book by that title. It's called Tough, Sweet, and Stuffy. However, we're talking about comic essays, and someone once posited that the four types of satirical newspaper columns were wacky, a la Dave Barry; wry, a la Russell Baker; clever, a la Gary Trudeau; and corny, a la Molly Ivins. Now, Molly Ivins, of course, is a gifted essayist, and by corny, I think what they mean to say is fake corny, this sort of fake hick attitude. And you know, there are minor practitioners of the same sort of genres, which are wacky, wry, clever, and corny. Someone like Joe Bob Briggs is in the Molly Ivins corny school, and someone like Florence King is in the Russell Baker school of wry. And we could probably think of any of a number of wacky individuals who write humor columns or satirical newspaper columns. Now, Linda Barry, the cartoonist, came up with something that she uses as a comic technique in some of her cartoons. 9 answers to a question, all from a different point of view. This is a very useful device for generating comic material. Of course, David Letterman uses it in his top 10, although whether all of those answers are from a different point of view, they may be written by different individuals, as they most assuredly are. As a matter of fact, the top 10 list is composed by giving each of the writers a topic and asking them to come up with 30 jokes on that topic. And of course, by the end of the day, he has about 150 of them to sift through and pick the best 10. So basically, he cuts 15 for 1, which isn't so good for a film cutting ratio, but is very good for a writing ratio. I think many writers cut only 2 for 1. But in any event, Linda Barry has this useful technique, and let's just call it 9 answers to a question, all from a different point of view. And as an example, she uses feminism. 9 answers to a question, all from a different point of view. Feminism. Too hairy. Too many rules. What was it? Too white. Anti-baby. They tricked me. Anti-fat. No profit. Lonely. And of course, she has the benefit of being a cartoonist and being able to illustrate the persons who are holding forth with this different point of view. However, this is very useful for the essayist to remember, or any writer, that people have different points of view depending on who they are, where they've been, where they've grown up, where they are now, and any of a number of factors. A married man will look at life somewhat differently than a divorced or single man, and if that man has children, he will look at life even more differently still. Dave Barry makes his living by taking prosaic ideas to incongruous extremes. A great many humor writers make their living by taking prosaic ideas to incongruous extremes. Dave Barry, however, is smart. He doesn't do it on the stage. He has his own newspaper forum in Miami. It's a sweet deal, but I'm sure it's a lot of hard work. Now, if you want to write a comic essay, you could do worse than to look at Dave Barry and try to write something inspired or more or less in his style, just as a starting point. This is not, but of course one should avoid slavishly imitating any of your role models. However, to me, the real kings of the comic prose style are H.L. Mencken, S.J. Perelman, to a lesser extent, although he wasn't really a comic writer, he had a profoundly satiric point of view. George Orwell, or you could even look toward children in order to survive. And unfortunately, of course, as with much of the best satire, people took him a little too literally. Not that they acted on it, but they thought he was serious. Newspapers are bought for the contribution of a single columnist when the columnist is pleasingly succinct, capable of being funny about serious matters, and winkles out truths that no one else bothers with. Well, I don't know about that latter one, but certainly in the old days at least, a newspaper would in fact sell on the strength of its column. Walter Winchell, for example, was a highly valued asset to the Hearst organization for many years because people would buy the paper just to see what dirt he was able to dish up on that particular day. Conformism, imitativeness, submission to rules and to teachings is the author's capital crime. Conformism, imitativeness, submission to rules and to teachings is the author's capital crime. Let's explore this a little bit. Maybe that's why so many writers are in fact nonconformists. They instinctively realize that the whole point of writing isn't merely to echo a consensus viewpoint or to be a cheerleader for the status quo, but to strike out and explore other points of view. Imitativeness is even more of a sin for writers than it would be for, say, pop musicians or motion picture makers, producers and directors. Just because of the versatility that the writer has at his command and the hard work which must go into crafting one's own style, it's almost a pity to rob another writer of his hard work by imitating his style and attempting to pass it off as an original style of your own. Submission to rules and to teachings, obviously apart from the obvious rules of syntax, grammar, spelling, logic, clarity, proportion, submission to rules and to teachings in particular. By teachings, I think what they mean is, say, religious philosophies or pseudo-religious or pseudo-mystical philosophies. Those books are almost invariably deadly, deadly dull, and with good reason, of course, because they are didactic only. They have no entertainment value whatsoever. And as Rita Mae Brown said, art is the most fortuitous mingling of entertainment and moral instruction. Entertainment without moral instruction is television. Moral instruction without entertainment is propaganda. And, of course, submission to rules and to teachings, or the dissemination of propaganda, is the author's capital crime, a point that Orwell made, that propaganda is inimical to writing and creativity. The wearying process of elucidation, Sebastian Faulks calls it. Whatever rule you may decide to ignore, the one crucial rule that you should probably not ignore unless you are a highly abstruse poet is the wearying process of elucidation. It is very difficult to make oneself clear, which is why whenever one purchases one of those assemble-at-home devices, it's so difficult to follow the instructions. It's very difficult to write clearly. And generally the people who write those instructions do the best job they can, but perhaps not the best job possible. Because I think they're afraid to sink into a sort of welcome level of informality, which might be more conducive to putting together something by yourself at home. If they would at least bother to tell you what kind of tools you were going to need beforehand, that would be very helpful. And what kind of difficulties you may encounter, it would be even more helpful, since inevitably one part won't fit. Anyway, this is Irma Bombeck material here, or Dave Barry material. Sort of wry, wacky trials and tribulations and travails of the bourgeoisie type. Yes, Mr. Boring Old Homeowner, Mr. Tired Businessman, lend me your ears. I may provoke a wry chuckle if nothing else. It certainly won't threaten any of your most dearly held beliefs. There is a criticism of life at the bottom of Thurber's work. Um, we're talking about the essayist James Thurber. There is a criticism of life at the bottom of Thurber's work, which of course would qualify him as a satirist. It is serious and even somber. Unlike so much humor, it is not merely a criticism of manners, that is, of the superficial aspects of a society at a given moment, but something more profound. His writings and also his illustrations are capable of surviving the immediate environment and time out of which they spring. To some extent, they will be a document of the age they belong to. Well, that's very nice. Not only are they capable of surviving that age, but they also document it to a certain degree. Of course, many people aspire not only to merely live on forever, but to transcend a mere documentation of their age and do something which is of universal interest. But very few people succeed in this. Among the discerning, one would probably cite Shakespeare first and foremost, and then perhaps Milton at his right hand. Now, I'm not just blowing smoke here. I've read Milton, and if you can slog through it, Paradise Lost is actually a monumental achievement and well deserving of its secondary but nevertheless primary place in the pantheon of English literature. And secondary only to Shakespeare is what I intend to imply. As a matter of fact, I don't think you'd get much argument from many English professors if you were to say that along with Shakespeare and Chaucer, Milton is up there in the holy trinity of writers of English, be it prose, poetry, or drama. So you have quite a pantheon here. Note that all three of them wrote poetry, although they approached it from different sorts of attacks. Milton was an epic poet with a highly didactic motivation, and Chaucer, although he had didacticism, he leavened it with a sort of coarse and earthy humor which enables us to read it some 600 years later and enjoy it once, of course, you get past the language in which he writes. And Shakespeare, the incomparable Shakespeare, with his borrowed finery, his plots taken from other sources, but yet given new life, breathed, in fact, to life. By his genius. Now don't listen to George Bernard Shaw. Shakespeare is, in fact, the greatest writer of English that we know of. Until someone else comes along to knock the crown off the Bard of Stratford-on-Avon. Thurber's work, getting back to James Thurber, Thurber's work captures conflicts, anxieties, and longings inherent in us all. A unique universe, a place of distinctive characters, sensibilities, and situations. A world of one's own. Terry Teachout speaks of the essayist's art and says that the essayist's art is a noble one, but the great essayists, like the great songwriters, never confuse brevity with triviality or lightness with weightlessness. While great humor is timeless, the output of professional humorists isn't. So what Terry Teachout is saying is that humor that cuts to the heart of the human condition, which in fact matters, is timeless, whereas humor which is more geared towards contemporary tastes is not. And again, I don't want to pick on poor old Dave Barry, but he's the biggest and most obvious target. Is a sort of perverse tribute to him that he gets mentioned because he is perhaps the most prominent syndicated humorist working today. And I would be hard-pressed to pick out any one of his humorous essays that I've read and say, this will stand for all time. But that wouldn't be very difficult to do with someone like S.J. Perelman Stephen or James Thurber, or even lesser known people like E.B. White. Period pieces: E.B. White, Robert Benchley, S.J. Perelman, Dorothy Parker, George S. Kaufman, Alexander Woollcott. Memorable regulars: H.L. Mencken, Edmund Wilson, A.J. Liebling, and Mitchell. Of course, these are all New Yorker writers to a greater or lesser extent. And Mitchell's Down in the Old Hotel is a wonderful book, wonderfully written. You can get it at the Cambridge Public Library. I read it cover to cover. It's rather dense, but well worth the time and effort. And if there is a run on this book, I'll know that somebody's watching this. Gore Vidal said that in his essays, he always tried to say something so obvious that no one else has noticed it. Harvey Kurtzman said something similar in that his aim was to show the American people as ugly as they really were, but so that they would not recognize themselves. Gore Vidal puts it in a more refined way. I have always tried to say something so obvious that no one else has noticed it. Of course, his observation that the Democrats and the Republicans were really just one party is one of these. His other observation that the majority party in this country is that of people who do not vote is another. Gore Vidal is just brimming with good ideas, and he's developed a rather stylish way of communicating them to us. Wit is supposed to go for the jugular, not the jocular, says Florence King, who is another one of my favorites. Along, of course, with Molly Ivins, although I must say I enjoy Florence King a bit more. And, of course, there's this big pissing match between the two of them. Flo accuses Molly of having plagiarized her. Molly has no real adequate defense for this. But, you know, it's, excuse me, sorry I'm so sleepy, but it's rather early in the morning. It's a mere bag of shells, let's put it that way, and leave it at that. Humor is the revenge of the normal, as a wise man once quipped. Okay, Scott Walker, if you say so. You should kill your opponent's earnestness with jesting, says Aristotle. And, of course, that is to a great degree what the Republican presidential candidates are doing to each other at this point in the race. By the time you see this, of course, it will probably be all over with the shouting, but you should kill your opponent's earnestness with jesting. So when Steve Forbes refers to Alexander as Alexander's ragtime sham, or whatever it was he said, Alexander's ragtime scam, he is killing his opponent's earnestness with jesting. Although one doesn't usually associate Steve Forbes with these wry quips, that's generally more like Bob Dole's job. And of course, Pat Buchanan occasionally weighs in with a good one himself. A memoir is how one remembers one's own life, while an autobiography is history, requiring research, dates, facts, double-checked. I have taken the memoir route on the ground that even an idling memory is apt to get right what matters most. Well, here we're sort of veering off from the topic of the comic essay into the topic of the memoir. But the two forms have a great deal in common, particularly the comic essay and the memoir, because an essay is really essentially an attempt. As I mentioned earlier, it's the French word for attempt. It's an attempt to a certain degree to encapsulate a small part of one's life recalled in contemplation. It does not necessarily follow that it is strictly autobiographical. However, a great many essayists use autobiographical material as a jumping off point at the very least in order to craft an essay. Cézanne, says Johnson, approached painting like a blind man, struggling not simply to imitate nature, but to realize the sensations he felt in its presence. A more difficult thing to do in painting than in the essay. And it's important enough that I don't feel too embarrassed to repeat the point. Cézanne approached painting like a blind man, struggling not simply to imitate nature, but to realize the sensations he felt in its presence. If you can realize the sensations that you feel, if you can make them real in the form of an essay, or for that matter, a short story, or more importantly, perhaps, in a stand-up comedy format, if you can make people feel what you are feeling, then you don't have to bother being fake friendly or appealing to their sympathy. You will win their friendship and their sympathy if you are able to make them feel the way you feel. If you can get them to develop empathy for you without stooping to pander, then your job has mostly been accomplished and the laughs will follow forthwith. Thermonuclear war planning, a world of collective eccentricity, a monstrous zeal bereft of any greatness. Of course, that was a ripe subject for parody, a la Dr. Strangelove. Harass all establishments, Robert St. John's recipe for long life. Harass all establishments, not bad advice at all. The best reading of art is art, says George Steiner. So if you're a critic, keep this in mind, because I think that criticism may sting somewhat less if the person who writes it shows some interest in crafting a work of art, which in turn can be criticized. Of course, if the work of art becomes more popular than the work it criticizes, then the criticism will sting more, not less. Most dialogues of the self are anxious affairs, self-admiration trying to win a little ground from engulfing self-doubt, says Michael Wood. And of course, this one of the biggest key points of the type of neurotic comedy made popular by Woody Allen and later by, to a certain lesser extent, Rodney Dangerfield and Stephen Wright, is in fact that they are dialogues with the self, anxious affairs, self-admiration, trying to win a little ground from self-doubt. Laura Vidal writes in Palimpsest, I am happy to be at the edge. I am happier to be at the edge as one is in an essay, studying someone else or what someone else has made art of. So remember that the essay is not simply an open-ended form, but it can be about certain topics and can fall into certain categories. A critique of an artwork is more or less contemporaneous with the appearance of that work of art, be it music, drama, film, literature, painting, sculpture, what have you. But an essay can be written about any work of art created at any time. For example, if I were to write a essay called, say, Rumble in the Bronx, that would be taken as a film review. But if I were to write an essay called On Jackie Chan, that would be, in fact, an essay, because it would be about a wider topic and yet a contemporary one. And if I were to write an essay called On Citizen Kane, that would obviously be even more of a serious essay, since Citizen Kane came out some 45 years ago. Robert B. Parker said that bad writing is easy to spot and easy to explain, perhaps because there is so much of it. But what makes great writing better than good writing remains unclear. Well, yes, it is unclear, but a point I made last week about how something will strike you, particularly in the work of John Osborne, how you'll sort of be struck with this sense that something magical is going on. That perhaps distinguishes great writing from good writing. Emily Dickinson, in a quip popular in the college I attended, said that when a poem is good, you can feel it. You can feel it tingling in the base of your at the top of your spine, and it feels like your head's about to come off. Um, Robert B. Parker also said that reality is the sweetest dream of all. Andrew Ferguson, in criticizing a current trend, also unwittingly perhaps points out its applicability. He says, currently fashionable oxymorons meant to jazz up something unexciting by turning it with a self-canceling, by twinning it with a self-canceling opposite. Hot coldness, for example. But this is a valuable sort of exercise to sort of toy with contradictory ideas inside of one's head and see what one can make of them. Well, before I continue, I think I'm going to get me some more coffee. I'll be right back with more of The Wrong Hero in Sketch. Well, I'm back in the saddle again. Robert David Sullivan talks about today's, hey, you notice I shaved. Robert David Sullivan talks about today's most popular humorists. Today's most popular humorists may work in their vernacular, but they share little else with Thurber. Bestsellers by Jerry Seinfeld, Tim Allen, and Ellen DeGeneres retain the staccato style of their stage performances, and although most of these comics echo Thurber's little man persona, trying to cope with bull-headed authority figures or the baffling behavior of the opposite sex, we still sense the confidence of people able to bare their souls in public and not hide behind the printed word. Even humor writers who didn't start out on the stage now adopt the ironic distance of a Letterman or a Leno. Dave Barry constantly winks at the reader in the same way David Letterman smirks and plays with his tie to get a laugh when a joke falls flat. For instance, Barry likes to insist sarcastically that he is not making this up in particularly fanciful columns. Thurber invented half the stuff about his family in My Life in Hard Times, but he had the sense not to go on about it in print. Well, I think that the lesson to be found in this is more or less self-evident. Number one, that you can adopt a humorous little man against the world persona to drive the comic essay in much the same way that I've been insisting all along that one of the archetypal themes of comedy is a matter of fact, me versus the world. Garrison Keillor, says Mark Stein, trying so damn hard to be lovable. That, of course, can be the kiss of death among discerning critics, such as Mr. Stein. Robert David Sullivan on Thurber. Much of Thurber's best work came in the form of a New Yorker invention called The Casual, a short essay or story written in the form of a friendly letter. Thurber and the other writers of the late 1920s were part of the shift towards the vernacular in American humor, as in contrast to Mark Twain and other late 19th century writers who used dialect as a common device, which was a reaction to the Baroque language of British humorists. But few have approached the graceful chaos of My Life in Hard Times, which isn't a great source of one-liners. The humor generally builds through misunderstandings that are layered on top of each other, or through absurd repetitions. I recall a Thurber story in which the narrator stays up half the night trying to remember the name of the New Jersey City Perth Amboy. Unfortunately, most humorists prefer hanging around the street lamps, producing observations about everyday life. Did you ever notice, and references to popular culture that have no resonance after a few years? And he could not have said it better than I could have. That is to say, I could have said it better than him. Thurber as miniaturist. Writers of light pieces running from 1,000 to 2,000 words. You never get so deep into them, but that you feel you can get out. Robert Benchley could never have written those sentences. Donald Barthelme could have, and maybe Franz Kafka or John Cheever. They resonate with that part of literary modernity for which Thurber can claim responsibility. The part that is funny, large-hearted, nervous, troubling, and terrifically smart. That, of course, is key. That Thurber's humor was not only humorous, it is hilariously funny, but it was also very, very smart. Now I know why university professors occasionally insert pauses. It is because they are frantically trying to rearrange their notes for the benefit of their class without letting the class in on the secret. An essay, to conclude then with our section on the essay, as Robert Musil, the author of The Man Without Qualities, put it, an essay is the unique and unalterable form assumed by a man's inner life in a decisive thought. The essayist is a master of the inner hovering life. So again, we get this theme that the essay is no more and no less than contemplation rendered into feeling, and feeling rendered into print. The essayist is a master of the inner hovering life. It's like having a baby. The hardest part is getting the head out, says Beavis Hillier on article writing. And indeed, coming up with that snappy first paragraph is hell. Almost as much trouble is coming up with the strong conclusion, although you can take the lazy way out and simply reiterate the beginning, altering it slightly in some way to reflect the fact that you have progressed from point A to point C, and that point B lay in between. And so C is actually a subset of point A. In other words, it was a dark and stormy night. Suddenly a pirate ship appeared on the horizon. The night was dark and stormy, but now a new menace hove into view. Stephen Jay Gould, says Philip Lopate, writes in a consistently graceful, approachable style with elegance and clarity, and he is an incomparable explainer of difficult ideas. That perhaps is the beau ideal of the essayist. Gracefulness, approachable style, elegance and clarity, and of course explaining difficult ideas. Essays, says this exemplar, Stephen Jay Gould, essays are stories. Not far wrong there. Shouldn't have eaten those 3 eggs for breakfast, eh? A what? Let's talk a little bit about sketch humor. Unfortunately, I don't have much in the way of notes for this particular section, but never you mind. Although this is a 2-hour presentation, I'm afraid the discussion of sketch humor itself, ostensibly the title and subject of this particular piece, will only occupy roughly 2 to 4 minutes. But hey, at least it occurred at a good spot, practically right smack dab in the middle. So you've waded through 1 hour of essay, and you'll probably hear another hour worth of commentary on poetry. Next week, of course, is going to be plenty hot. We have, we're talking about black humor and satire, a subject dear to my heart. But let's talk a little bit about sketch humor. Of course, when we think sketch humor, we're thinking Saturday Night Live, right? I mean, that's the big one. I mean, there's Mad TV, there's The State, there's any of a number of sketch humor troupes. not only on television, but perhaps in your very own city. However, Saturday Night Live for the last 20 years has been the ne plus ultra of sketch humor. Now, let's not neglect to note that Saturday Night Live got its start from the National Lampoon and the National Lampoon Radio Hour and its stage performances. Many of the stars of the first through third seasons of Saturday Night Live came from the National Lampoon's glory days, at least according to one of their writers who wrote a book. What's it called? Going Too Far. SNL was so hated it was strangely hot, it was said of its recent 20th season. Its genuinely unbearable past seasons have worked to SNL's advantage as well as Mad TV's in the sense that our expectations for sketch comedy have diminished. Of course, a great many people consider Sid Caesar to have been perhaps the only real comedian ever to have worked on television outside of the sitcom format. So again, you have the Holy Trinity syndrome going on here. You have Lucille Ball at the right hand, Jackie Gleason at the left hand, and of course Sid Caesar and Imogene Coca. Let's not forget her. Of course, an ill-advised move was made to split them up, thinking that twice as much profit was to be had in doing so, which was not the case. Imogene Coca appeared in It's About Time, but of course I was too young to realize her glory days had in fact been 10 years previous. Now they were showing some old Sid Caesar Your Show of Show sketches on the Comedy Network for some time. So if anybody wanted to see them, they probably certainly could have. However, if you missed them, stick around. They're well worth examining, if only as examples of the humor of that period. It should be understood that sketch comedy has become increasingly difficult to produce. What does it mean to produce alternative comedy when mainstream pop culture has become so self-mocking? A good point, indeed. There is the difficulty of producing intelligent satire in a world in which reality at times resembles a series of lame celebrity sketch conceits. A point made before, perhaps, but adapted to current situations. I really don't think that sketch humor, which revolves around things that are on television or the doings of celebrities and makes that its principal topic, is really worthy of the name of sketch humor. Sketch humor ought to arise out of character. Now, I don't remember, it's one of the newer sketch humor shows, and I don't remember which one it was, unfortunately. I believe it was on something like MTV or something like that. But there was this annoying character who would insult people, but he would get it slightly wrong. So instead of calling somebody a tramp, he would refer to them as trimp, and he was constantly getting his block knocked off. Now, I think that's what good sketch humor should aspire to, is to create recognizable character stereotypes and put them in changing situations. Well, like Chris Farley in his I live in a van down by the riverside. Now, that's a good example of what I'm getting at. That sort of humor appeals to me a great deal more than mockery of negligible celebrities or parodies of television shows. I have seen one or two devastating commercials on Saturday Night Live. It's something they do best. Most recently, they had something for AM Ale, which of course was very nearly indistinguishable from an actual ad for a beer that's intended to drink as a breakfast meal. But a couple of years back, they had this thing about this cartoon chicken that was explaining as it had its head cut off how good it tasted. And of course, that was quite grotesque, but nevertheless a high point. in recent years, and one which they recognized as such since they showed it during one of their 1993-94 retrospectives. Talking a little bit about British humor, said Keith Waterhouse refers to the Goon Show, Private Eye, which is their satirical magazine, Viz, which is a British underground cartoon magazine which parodies not the sorts of things that American underground cartoonists would parody. It initially started out as a parody of British comic books intended for children, which you've probably never seen these, but they are very different from American comic books intended for children. Um, um, they're built around various conceits, like Billy Basher and the Limehouse Kids, or Ivor, Lot, and Tony Broke, rich kid versus a poor kid. I guess they're more analogous to certain Harvey comics, but even so, the Harvey comics have this patina of slickness and this sheen about them, which can't be matched by the British children's comic books. And of course, they don't change very much. There may be a ripple effect that popular culture has on them, but like they might have something like Baby Rambo or a shark to reflect various crazes of that nature. But of course, those strips come and go, and the old reliables always remain. They have a strip called Desperate Dan, which is apparently based in the American frontier, and yet all the judges wear wigs and robes, a la Great Britain. So it's really quite odd. The Goon Show, Private Eye, Viz, and Monty Python have a special place in the hearts of many people with an underdeveloped sense of humor. This is not to say that these institutions are not funny in their own right, but that those who are unsure about what they ought to be laughing at find it reassuring to be firmly advised, this is wacky, this is zany, laugh. Well, I think a lot of people used to feel that way about Saturday Night Live, although not so much anymore. Let's talk a little bit about sketch comedy. Martin Short has this gimmick that he does, impressions of famous people in 2 to 4 words. And of course you could do Jerry Lewis that way, like, but actually for all of his idiotic personas, Jerry Lewis is actually very discerning about sketch comedy. Jerry Lewis has said, an underdog is always sweet. And of course he managed to pound that one into the ground again and again. But perhaps what is key to this section on sketch comedy is a comment that Jerry Lewis made. The key to sketch comedy is to find the man in trouble. And again, it's also a key to formulaic sitcoms as well. Somebody creates a problem, the problem bubbles up to a boil, and then someone wiser comes in and straightens the problem out. And again, it's rather formulaic. Product-related crisis, product introduction, crisis resolution. It's every bit as formulaic as the very television commercials which intersperse the programming. A point which I never seem to get tired of making, incidentally. But, nevertheless, I think I pretty much exhausted the topic of the essay and sketch humor, so I will take a brief pause and consult my notes, and we will discuss poetry, and hopefully specifically comic poetry, as we return. Well, I'm back. It is perhaps fortunate that I have prepared an embarrassment of material for these monologues, since one of them did come up considerably short and will have to be augmented. Well, let's talk a little bit about comic verse. Now, That was supposed to have been the topic of the fifth week. However, I don't think anybody will um, be any too unhappy to discover that, excuse me, it has to pull its weight and take up the slack for the deficiencies of this particular week. Um, Goodness me. I also have quite a bit about the media and spoken word. So let's use that as a sort of natural segue into verse, from the specific into the even more specific into the general, or vice versa. We have transformed information into a form of garbage in ourselves and the garbage collectors, says Neil Postman about the media. And that's certainly one point of view which it would be profitable to explore. The media as garbage and ourselves as garbage collectors, or let's say witting garbage cans or trash receptacles. Talking point journalism, says Ian Jack. Everybody's talking about X, so we'll have to find some way to echo what they're talking about. Now, Christopher Hitchens wrote about Mother Teresa in a critical way. Alan Archibald comments on this by saying, Hitchens' critique of Mother Teresa reminds us how easily one may garner publicity by savaging orthodoxy in any of its manifestations. How easily one may garner publicity by savaging orthodoxy in any of its manifestations. Of course, that's something that Pat Buchanan is making his reputation on. About spoken word, there was a learned article in Motor Booty number 7 from fall of 1994, one of the few fanzines that it is worth your while perhaps to subscribe to, or at least purchase an individual copy of. It's published out of Detroit, and it does do music, but it also has much to say about other matters as well. The spoken word universe doesn't end with Rawlings. Feeding off the legitimate innovation of the last poets, jazz poetry, and hip-hop, the nascent genre has become the missing link, a countercultural piltdown man between stand-up comedy and off-Broadway theater. Although most people with discriminating tastes view poetry readings as the equivalent of vacation slideshows, spoken word performances and poetry slams have drawn conspicuously bountiful crowds and extensive media coverage across the country. Then again, on the positive side, these spectacles, like tractor pools and large sporting events, take undesirable elements off the streets so decent citizens can conduct their affairs in peace. A very finely crafted little bit of commentary. Now let's talk a little bit about Michael Moore, who of course had a show on television and also did that movie Roger and Me. What Michael Moore does is stage hit-and-run attacks on the media protocols of American society, says Pat Dowell in a recent issue of In These Times. Of course, that's a 60s slogan, strike and fade. Michael Moore stages hit-and-run attacks on the media protocols of American society. Finally, Stephen Glover says concerning journalism, journalism is like showbiz, with this difference, that not only are the stars sometimes dashed to earth, but the ordinary and unoffending foot soldiers can be plucked out and thrown aside at the whim of a new editor or a management. Tell them all this, and then say that journalism is fun, which indeed it is, even though it is not a very secure profession, and very few people rise to the top of that profession, which is of course the case in many professions, but perhaps even more so in journalism. And of course, in journalism, a success can be a failure. How? I call it Kansas City Star Syndrome. You may be a staff writer for the Providence Journal-Bulletin, but that does not mean that your name is at all known outside of journalistic circles, because, of course, Providence is not a major media market. However, you could be a staff writer on the Boston Globe or even the Boston Herald, and it's possible that your name might carry some weight in, say, Washington, D.C., but not necessarily in New York City or or Los Angeles. You, in fact, would have to be writing on the New York Times or the Los Angeles Times in order to have your name be resident. If you're writing for a market such as, say, Atlanta, Georgia, or Dallas, Texas, you're still writing for the hinterlands to a certain degree. Even if you're writing for the Miami Herald, Miami, Atlanta, and Dallas are respectively the capitals of the Northeast, the South, and the Southwest. But nevertheless, they are to a certain degree provincial and regarded as such. And only California, Chicago, Washington, D.C., New York City, and to a lesser extent San Francisco and Boston are really considered to be weighty journalistic venues. So only in journalism can your fame in one city fail to really translate into a type of fame which ordinarily would be your due. And that's the nature of media. It creates a few superstars at the top of the pyramid, and everybody else does the grunt work in their own little bailiwicks, and they may be at the top of their pyramids there, but that does not necessarily translate very well. And of course, forget it if you're in a small market of 100,000, like Providence, say, or Worcester, or Quincy, for that matter. You just don't rate. In fact, that's the way you work yourself up. That's the way you work your way up to the top in any market. Is you start out in the provinces and you eventually make your way to the media capitals. In this case, New York and Los Angeles, as everybody knows. Comic verse. True comic verse is always inseparable from comic verve, says Patricia Clark. What's essential to the comic poem is, of any period, is aplomb. But once this quality gets touched with modish self-regard or whimsy, the thing is apt to turn completely jejune. So for example, Lord Byron has, in his Don Juan, has just the right amount of aplomb. Although there may be a certain degree of modish self-regard, there is certainly very little in the way of whimsy to be found in Don Juan. And once again, I know when I speak, I read all of Don Juan, and I enjoyed it immensely. And of course, it had an inimical effect on my own poetry style for many years. High moments of highly compassionate wit. Henry Taylor says this about Langston Hughes. Langston Hughes recently had a volume of his collected verses come out, which, well, of course, many of them don't necessarily do him credit since they are lesser works, written occasional verses, things that weren't intended to be of lasting value. But again, it gives you an idea of the wide scope of his interests and abilities, that his collected verses are in fact so very thick. It was from Marianne Moore that Elizabeth Bishop learned to hone her powers of description and concentrate on the telling, quirky detail that would best startle readers into a sense of something freshly seen, says Phoebe Pettengill in the excellent New Leader periodical, of which I've spoken earlier. I studied under Elizabeth Bishop, and she taught a course on 20th century poetry. But of course, to her, 20th century poetry was the beginning of the 20th century. So that meant we got to read a lot of Thomas Hardy, who wrote poems, and very good ones. In fact, after Jude the Obscure's somewhat less than enthusiastic reception by the critics in 1895, Thomas Hardy turned to writing poetry exclusively for the next 25 years. And Robert Frost, of course, was another giant, and William Carlos Williams. And those were considered 20th century poets because they seemed to be in a direct line of descent, not from British poets, but from poets such as Walt Whitman and Emily Dickinson. William Carlos Williams had a great deal in common with Dickinson and with William Carlos and with Whitman. Anyway, Elizabeth Bishop learned to hone her powers of description and concentrate on the telling, quirky detail that would best startle readers into a sense of something freshly seen. Now, the telling quirky detail is something that all comic writers would do well to cultivate the ability to see. In Bishop, Pettengill goes on to state, a subtle humor frequently serves to maintain a balanced tone when the feelings expressed might otherwise degenerate into bathos, hysteria, or stridency. Although being funny is typically seen as a way to dodge uncomfortable or unpleasant reactions, for Bishop it serves to enhance her depictions of unhappy, even tragic experience. You might say that levity is the soul of wit, if you wanted to be humorous about it. Helen Vendler, who is perhaps the foremost critic writing about poetry today, at least in my mind, Phoebe Pettengill is also quite good, but she writes for a rather obscure journal, whereas Helen Vendler's work tends to appear more in the New Republic. That digestion of thought into style that alone allows poetically successful representation of belief. That digestion of thought into style that alone allows poetically successful representation of belief, says Helen Vendler. I think she may have been speaking of Elizabeth Bishop. When Bishop spoke of Vermeer's paintings, the objects in them are very precisely observed and rendered. She might have been describing her own work, which combines rigorous observation with a highly economical and disciplined line to provide verse that points to a mystery at the heart of things and conditions. Now, this is not necessarily your task as a stand-up comedian, but a disciplined line to provide verse that points to a mystery at the hearts of things and conditions. You could aspire to worse things in any medium in which you ply your trade. T.S. Eliot writes about the poet in a rather famous essay. He stated, "The poet's first purpose is to amuse, and unless he can amuse, all else is vain, but he speaks in parables. The artist is the only genuine and profound revolutionist in the following sense. The world always has and always will tend to substitute appearance for reality. The artist, being always alone, being heterodox when everyone else is orthodox, is the perpetual upsetter of conventional values, the restorer of the real. His function is to bring back humanity to the real." Of course, you could go overboard in this, and people would regard you as a smelly eccentric instead of as the great literateur that you obviously wish to be mistaken for. The important poets will be those who have thought the people's speech, who have taught the people's speech. I'm sorry. The important poets will be those who have taught the people speech. And the people had in every generation to be taught to speak. The function of the poet at every moment is to make the inarticulate folk articulate. And as the inarticulate folk is almost always mumbling the speech, become jargon of its ancestors or of its newspaper editors. Because the inarticulate folk is always mumbling its speech, the new language is never learnt without a certain resistance, even resentment. This purification of language is not so much a progress as it is a perpetual return to the real. This is a very striking point that he makes, that the artist, the poet, is the perpetual upsetter of the conventional values, but also that he is responsible for a perpetual return to the real. That again is a definition of satire, the stripping away of the differences between illusion and reality. In his mixed mode of pontificating jester, Kenneth Koch is himself ripe for parody. Kenneth Coach, or Koch, or however you want to say his name, is, of course, I think, one of the finest poets of this age, which sort of dates me. He really had his heyday in the 50s and the 60s, but his longer poems read as gracefully as very finely crafted essays. And if there's any one style that I am indebted to other than, in poetry, other than that of Edward Dorn, it would be probably, without my realizing it, Kenneth Coach, at least among contemporary poets. Coach, or Koch, let's just call him Kenneth Koch and leave it at that, K-O-C-H. Koch often borrows the swashbuckling ottava rima favored by Lord Byron. Its conventional lilt and the smart alecky humor of many of the rhymes suit his breezy style, and like Byron, he excels at combining satire and sentiment, speculation and fast-moving plot. Love and its shortcomings fuel the imaginations of both men, says Phoebe Pettingill, and perhaps that is why I like Kenneth Koch so much, because he is so much like another one of my favorites, Lord Byron. Now, Alexander Pope is not somebody I've ever really spent a great deal of time attempting to plumb the depths of, but I can also highly recommend him as well as an example of comic verse, or perhaps more profoundly serious satirical verse. You might want to look into the Oxford Book of Satiric Verse if you are interested in this topic. You will find that satiric verse tends to have more of a point and be less impressionistic than much modern, which is to say post-1950s American poetry. Helen Vendler speaks of a poet's career. The time eventually comes in a good poet's career when readers actively long for his books to know that someone out there is writing down your century, your generation, your language, your life, under whatever terms of difference, makes you wish for news of yourself, for those authentic tidings of invisible things, as Wordsworth called them, that only come in the interpretation of life voiced by poetry. Well, indeed, authentic tidings of invisible things are, as a matter of fact, one of the functions of poetry which cannot be well served by other literary media. Authentic tidings of invisible things. J.B. McClatchy talks about James Merrill, another one of my favorites. James Merrill sought to release the textures and colors of objects, the inner life of our arrangements, the hidden relationships among motives and emotions, the secrets of childhood and the energies of the unconscious. And again, the energies of the unconscious, another thing that poetry does better, perhaps, than most other mediums, except with the possible exception of stream of consciousness prose, such as popularized by James Joyce. Merrill would say that the natural word order isn't C.J. and run. The more natural way to put it is actually more complex. Where on earth can that child be racing off to? Why, it's little you know the neighbor's brat, Jane. Poetry, says Adam Zagajewski, attempts to cheat reality. It pretends that it takes reality's worries seriously. Poetry fears that its secret will be discovered. One day, reality may notice that the heart of poetry is cold. Well, I'm not sure I agree with that, but it's an interesting point that poetry pretends to take reality's worries seriously, which, of course, would be somewhat contradictory of poetry's role as bringing authentic tidings of invisible things to serve as the engine of the unconscious, and so on. Robert Graves said often that he bred show dogs in order to be able to afford a cat. The dogs were prose, the cat was poetry. Robert Graves, of course, wrote an excellent book in collaboration with another individual entitled The Reader Over Your Shoulder, and it is certainly a very, very fine book for any person who aspires to write. It's perhaps the only writing book you will ever need. As Shelley put it, Wordsworth says, authentic tidings of invisible things, and I say poetry is the engine of the unconscious, but Shelley states that it is to walk in the visions of poesy. Johnson, in The Economist, talks about the music of poetry. He says it must be a music latent in the common speech of its time. There can no longer be serious work in poetry written in poetic diction. Thus, T.S. Eliot and William Carlos Williams, respectively. Both were talking nonsense. Endless times, poetry has been written for at least 2,500 years, and it is being written today. That breaks these distinguished poets would be rule. It may be good advice, but as an assertion of fact, it is false. David Crystal describes this as the contemporary orthodoxy among poets, just as its reverse was the contemporary orthodoxy in England 2 centuries ago, and to judge from surviving works of ancient Rome and Athens. So it's good to know these rules in order to break them. There can no longer be serious work in poetry written in poetic diction, says William Carlos Williams. Well, poetic diction is something to avoid, but it isn't necessarily something that one simply must not do. The music of poetry must be a music latent in the common speech of its time, says T.S. Eliot. Well, that is certainly the case with the work of Robert Frost and with his own work in The Wasteland, but it is not necessarily a hard and fast rule. Vernon Shelley talks about James Merrill. He says, James Merrill was continually in the habit of bringing together great things with small. He could take the most ordinary or seemingly unpoetic matters as a starting point, confident that any subject will, with a few quick metaphoric transformations, expand to bear the weight of the world. And that is certainly the case. I think my downstairs neighbor is getting tired of hearing me rattle on like this and has turned on some music in order to drown out the monotonous drone of my tedious voice. I hope that the music does not, in fact, distract you over much. Merrill's aim is to purify the language of the tribe by passing through the alembic of his style, the linguistic dross thrown off by the everyday dishonesties of our society. Merrill once remarked, says Vernon Shelley, that he liked English in its billiard table sense. English in its billiard table sense. Words that have been set spinning against their own gravity. By making a virtue of exaggeration, says Robert von Hallberg, poetry cannot achieve justness and a sane assessment of our most difficult experiences. By making a virtue of exaggeration, poetry cannot achieve justness. And a sane assessment of our most difficult experiences is part of what is asked of the greatest poetry. To a poet, the worst crime is to be a polluter of language. And that's what poetry is all about. Poetry is about language, even more than syntax, even more than subject matter. Poetry is about language. And you can do wonderful things with language, and if you have a lot of time on your hands, rather than sit down and watch sitcoms, you can actually sharpen your comedic technique by picking up an anthology of poems and trying to read through it, using the notes that are appended to the poetry to guide you through your way. Now, if you wanted to have a mini course on what poems are essential for an understanding of contemporary verse, and yet poems which aren't necessarily too difficult for the lay person to understand, well, you could start with Hart Crane's The Bridge. Some Dylan Thomas would be nice. Do Not Go Gentle in That Good Night is always a good stopping off point. T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland. The four quartets are far more difficult, as are Ezra Pound's cantos. But William Carlos Williams would be good, Robert Frost, and try to read some of the poems of Thomas Hardy. Do a little Emily Dickinson, some dabble in some Walt Whitman, Allen Ginsberg, Gregory Corso, um, Kenneth Koch, whatever you want to call him. And that's a good starting point. As you read and discover more about poetry, you might become more interested in some of the less well-known practitioners of the genre. I don't think you should wallow in Anne Sexton and Sylvia Plath and E.E. Cummings, which are easy choices for people who think they're learning about poetry by reading these poets. They are very interesting poets in their own right, but you'd be better off reading someone like Elizabeth Bishop or Robert Lowell, um, just to get an idea of more formal types of poetry. I do say, I'll be back. I've got just a half an hour of this left to go. Well, I will have to fill this up a little bit by talking a little bit, although this is not entirely warranted, about my own background. For many years in the 1980s, I was in fact working on an epic poem, which of course I'm still in the process of working on. It has diminished, however, from its epic stature. It started out as, let's see, it had many books, many stanzas. It was probably well over 2,000 lines. But I managed to saw it down the size, and now it's just under 500 lines in length, approximately the length of an excellent poem by Dr. Johnson called London, which I would highly recommend as a part of your curriculum, if you would. Of course, there's all of the romantic poets like Shelley and Keats and Lord Byron, but Dr. Johnson's London, very good poem. Of course, it's based on a Roman poem. In any event, Helen Vendler, quote, to cite her once again, and a great many of these citations will be from two people, Helen Vendler and Phoebe Pettengill. Helen Vendler states that poetry is language used in a special way, not merely to convey emotion or to purvey information or to facilitate conversation or to sum up an argument. It is language used with particular attention to binding its phrases together by sheer interior association, which is, of course, much the same thing that stand-up comedians do. These associations need to be emotional, logical, elusive, symbolic, phonetic, syntactic, and rhythmic, or at least a combination of several of these. That is why the language of ably written poetry seems much more musical as well as more dense than the language of conversation or journalism. Many overlapping associative patterns are at work at the same time in poetry. Now, Phoebe Pettengill talks about James Merrill, and one of the reasons he's in the news is he recently passed away. But James Merrill is an exemplar of many of the qualities of modern poetry which one should in fact strive to emulate. Although I should stress that he is only one member of one school of poetry, and there is a comic subtext to his verse which makes him an appropriate topic for discussion here today on this comprehensive course on American humor, chapter 8, entitled Sketch. And again, I apologize for the somewhat sketchy nature of this. It's sort of a catch-all for the topics that I didn't manage to get to because of time limitations in the other presentations. Merrill confessed that the popular music of his childhood had helped him find his voice, and this is the same for myself as well, actually. Merrill confessed that the popular music of his childhood had helped him find his voice, and he remembered nostalgically the charm of songs that still sound catchy, metropolitan, popular, without being entirely of the people. The lyrics are literate but not highbrow. Clever polysyllabic rhymes, allusions to remote places, hinted at sophistication, even as recurrent words like tears or heart or baby confirmed the soft spot beneath the glamorous know-it-all sneer. cocktail of effects, with its mix of irony and feeling. The seasonings of wit kept genuine seriousness from sounding earnest or forced. It helped him shake free from the portentous certainties T.S. Eliot had made de rigueur for the previous poetic generation. It is its evocative power that makes a word juste, says John Simon. Accurate, proper, right. And of course that was above all what James Merrill did in his verse. He used the right word because it had evocative power. And that is what all poets do, is strive to find the right word. It's even more important in poetry than it would be in a medium such as the short story, because of the weight each individual word has on the comparatively shorter form. With short story writers, a way of shortening is to reword, rephrase, use different syntax to express the same thought. Poets don't always have that luxury. Sometimes, in order to make a poem shorter, they have to make it longer by taking a word which doesn't seem right and breaking it down into component parts. In fact, one technique of poetry, and in fact, of that one that Henry James used in his book, The Turning of the Screw, his story, The Turning of the Screw, is to go to the Oxford English Dictionary, look up a single word, and find every single one of its meanings, and attempt to use that word in every single one of its different meanings. The cognate of screw, the Indo-European root of screw, is scarabus, which of course, and screw has a great many meanings, including a prison guard, to screw in, to fornicate, and so forth, to cheat. Anyway, read the story, then look at the Oxford English Dictionary definition, and then read it again, and see if you don't get my drift concerning utilizing that dictionary to find out all the possible different meanings of a word, and using that as a springboard for writing a poem. For that matter, for writing a humorous essay, or for doing a monologue. Robert Graves wrote whenever he could, wherever he was, convinced that in poetry lay a hope of sanity, but at the same time suspecting that his insanity made his poetry possible. Were he to be entirely sane, his creativity might dry up. He needed his madness, his nerve. The poetry was in the pain, says Alistair Reid. This, of course, is the popular theory that artists can't go to psychiatrists because the psychiatrist might cure them of whatever it is that compels them to be artistic. The same is true of comedians. A great many comedians go into analysis, but that does not, by necessity, make them any less funny. Sometimes understanding the roots of one's neuroses can actually prove such a source of strength that it generates new material rather than denying one access to one's creative muse. The coming together of dualities in a poem, speaking of the work of Robert Graves, and again this is Alistair Reid. The coming together of dualities, the coming together and the rending apart of dualities, this has been a recurrent leitmotif throughout this, what will be a 20-hour presentation. Thesis, antithesis, synthesis, the coming together of dualities in a poem, in, for that matter, a joke. An oxymoron is a perfect example, hot, coldness, the coming together of dualities. It's a recurrent theme in all artistic endeavors. Robert Graves had redefined the obligations of a poet, which he sustained by a body of mythological connection, a whole cosmography, and a poetic creed that was coherent and rooted in the past. Well, we're going to get off the track of modern poetry and Robert Graves and talk a little about a representative songwriter. And that, of course, is Randy Newman. Randy Newman's art relies on subtly exploiting the tendency of educated adults to seek greater meaning from essentially straightforward prose, and his sense of craft ensures that his lyrics hold up under closer scrutiny. Uh, well, an example of that would be, I'll take the train into the city in the morning. You may be plain, but I think you're pretty in the morning. Some nights we'll go out dancing, if we are not too tired. Some nights we'll sit romancing, watching the late show by the fire. When our kids are grown, with kids of their own, they'll send us away to a little home in Florida where we'll play checkers all day until we pass away. That's from the song You and Me. Randy Newman talks about his craft. I don't want to be a bad guy, but if I am a bad guy, I don't want it to show up in my work because my work means too much to me. I finally know that I'm going to be a writer all my life in some sort of way. It's more important to me than my family or anything else. It's bullshit if I say that anything means more to me, cause none of it does. Well, and that's quite a telling statement. Of course, it was Faulkner who said that the true writer would sacrifice would sacrifice anything in order to pursue his craft, and that the Keats's ode on a Grecian urn is worth any number of old ladies. He was perhaps being somewhat facetious, but nevertheless, he did say the writer would sacrifice his own grandmother if it meant he would be able to write. What shocks the virtuous philosopher delights the chameleon poet. What shocks the virtuous philosopher delights the chameleon poet, says Keats. Speaking of which, how does the poem work? Asks P.J. Kavanaugh. Does it rhyme, or in what way? Or what other armature of rhythm and reason holds it together? Auden looked into a poem at first as if it were a piece of machinery. Now, mechanics and such, people who are good with their hands, they look down on literary types as being impractical, not solidly grounded. But who is to say what's really ultimately more important in this life? Mechanical ability? People who write also have a degree of mechanical ability which it is difficult for a person who is used to working with machinery to understand or justify as a skill in its own right. We all know about the fellow who can fix a Ford engine but can't write a business letter to save his life. And of course there are many more folks who can write a business letter but can't fix a Ford engine. And rare are the folks who can do both well. But I suppose what I'm getting at is that everybody has their own skills and they shouldn't look down on others because they are lacking in those skills, but they should, in fact, endeavor to teach them what they can of those skills. Robert Frost's tone, the authoritative but ambiguous distance of a master ironist, says Derek Walcott about one of my favorite 20th century poets, Robert Frost. The authoritative but ambiguous distance of a master ironist. Frost's writing achieved a vernacular elation in tone, not with the cheap device of dialect spelling or rustic vocabulary, but with a clean ear and fresh eye. I'm afraid most people wince when they see things written in dialect or with dialectic spelling or corny cornball vocabulary, unless it's readily understandable. Robert Frost himself said, "The sounds of sense with all their irregularities of accent across the regular beat of the meter." That was his explanation of his particular technique. Robert Frost, who actually Derek Walcott goes on to say, one of the two say, "A certain deadening of the ear had dated dramatic verse since the Victorians, who tried to resuscitate Elizabethan and Jacobean drama through the pentameter, prolonging a hollow, martial echo that could not render the ordinary domestic that did not the ordinary and domestic that did not take into account the charged and broken syntax of Webster or the late Shakespeare. So before you say Shakespeare wrote exclusively in iambic pentameter, and that iambic pentameter is what 90% of English verse is written in, do consider that iambic pentameter is a somewhat rigid form. The same reverential monotony occurred in Victorian epic poetry. The Elizabethan echo had become part of the soaring architecture, a determination to be sublime that again divided the lyric from the dramatic voice, that took poetry away from the theater and back to the library. And this, in fact, is too important a point to let pass without further explication. To take poetry away from the theater and back to the library. Poetry is, above all, an oral form. This is, in fact, the first thing you will learn if you take a course in versification, or, in fact, for that matter, in English literature. Poetry is intended to be read out loud. I know that I shall meet my fate somewhere among the clouds above. Those that I fight, I do not hate. Those that I guard, I do not love. W.B. Yeats, an Irish airman, foresees his fate. I knew memorizing all that poetry would come in handy. In fact, it was Elizabeth Bishop who made us memorize these poems. I turn round like a dumb beast in a show, neither know where I'm going nor where I go. One of his later works, which I memorized because it was very short. Unfortunately, I didn't memorize the entirety of any poem. When as in silks my Julia goes, then, methinks, how sweetly flows that liquefaction of her clothes. Ellipse. Oh, how that glittering doth taketh me. I'm badly misquoting it, but anyway. Taking poetry away from the theater and back to the library. What a horrible thing to do. Vulgarity, the gift that comes from the mob, which great poetic dramatists possess, no matter how sublime their rhetoric, and which they need in order to force a single response from the audience, springs from the vernacular, from the oral rather than from the written, and is based on popular banalities of humor and pathos. This power is what separates, say, Browning from Shakespeare, this eagerness to entertain, to put it crassly. Derek Walcott has something very astute to say about poetry when he states, poetry is its own realm and does not pardon. So if your poetry is crummy, don't expect any sympathy from me, that's for sure. No siree doggies. The vernacular humor that exists in all great poets, the raw peculiarity, even provinciality of Dante, Shakespeare, and the always colloquial Frost, Derek Walcott goes on to say, to fight against the predictable tone of incantation was a great risk for the American. Frost was truly alone, in more ways than one, if Elizabeth Bishop's accounts of him are to be believed. I think she would agree with yet another thing that Derek Walcott has to say about Robert Frost, namely that the poems essentialize the life. They essentialize the life. Now, getting a little more modern here, let's talk about somebody else who I've had occasion not necessarily to study under, but at least to meet. Allen Ginsberg. The thing is, I didn't really get a chance much to talk to Allen Ginsberg. I had him autograph my book of his early poems called Empty Mirror, and he was very pleased that anybody still bothered with that. I actually prefer some of those poems to his later, more well-known work, but he sort of palmed me off on Peter Orlovsky, who spent a good deal of time telling me that the first thing I should do is buy some land, and who gave me a pamphlet from the Naropa Institute. Ginsberg's poetic models, Smart, Blake, Whitman, also relied on mountainous verbal buildups and on anguished or exalted personal experience to carry them through. Ginsberg was a bridge between the literary avant-garde and pop culture. Like television and advertising, his language is full of slogans and syntactically unbuttoned. He is funny and volatile in his emotions, unashamedly, religiously frank about the demands of the body and his disappointments, scavenging in his literary references, fast and pre-packed in his judgments, though maddeningly interested in his most banal reactions. He is at least open about his self-fascination. But Mr. Ginsberg has the balancing gifts of promiscuous curiosity and an almost sappy American optimism. That is the economist weighing forth on what is to be ultimately the reputation of Allen Ginsberg. A bridge between the literary avant-garde and pop culture. His language full of slogans, syntactically unbuttoned, funny, volatile in his emotions, frank about his body and its disappointments. Ezra Pound, of course, seemingly in response to this assessment of Allen Ginsberg, states, "You can spot a bad critic when he starts discussing the poet and not the poem." Well, I think the true test of a poet is whether or not he has ever written anything so memorable that it has passed into the language almost as a cliche. Of course, Shakespeare hogs a good deal of our attention in that way, but Allen Ginsberg's "I have seen the best minds of my generation destroyed by madness" is certainly one of those stereotypically poetic types of things that we think of when we think of beat poetry. Of course, if you were more thoroughly grounded in beat poetry, you might also think of Gregory Corso's "Should I get married? Should I be good? Astound the girl next door with my velvet suit and Faustus hood. Not take her to movies but to cemeteries, hugging and kissing and all the preliminaries, and she only going just so far, and me saying, 'You must feel, it is beautiful to feel,' and then leaning up against a gravestone, the constellations in the sky." "It is because I am struck," says Helen Bendler, "it is because I am struck always by a naive wonder at the convincingness of a poem that I feel driven to ask how that memorable persuasive power has been gained. Sometimes it can be gained by a conversational point of view which is so insistent and nagging that it simply sticks in the mind like very few things can other than advertisements. I'm afraid that most of our lyric poetry has been supplanted in its influence by advertisements, and of course one constantly finds snatches of pop songs and old advertisements and things of that nature floating up into one's mind at the most odd and inopportune moments. Right now for me it's "Five Guys Named Mo," which has been advertised incessantly in Providence on television there. But how has that memorable power been gained? As we wind down our presentation, we might spend the waning moments attempting to think about just how this is done. And in order to answer that, one would have to say, well, you just really don't know. What separates good art from great art? It's that ability to summon in the reader a response which enables the reader to transcend time and place. And once you're able to make the reader transcend time and place, then your work itself will transcend that very same time and place in which it was written and read. Bendler's argument is that poetry is a special way of confronting and symbolically resolving the hard facts of life, says A.D. Scott in his critique of a critic. Poetry is a special way of confronting and symbolically resolving the hard facts of life. Now, there are as many contradictory statements as to what constitutes poetry, as there are critics of poetry. But Helen Wendler earlier stated, poetry is language used in a special way. It is language used with particular attention to binding its phrases together by sheer interior association. And in doing so, confronts and symbolically resolves the hard facts of life. The poem is the cry of its occasion, part of the race itself, and not about it. Race, of course, is R-E-S, it means thing. So let's paraphrase. The poem is the cry of its occasion, part of the thing itself, and not about it. The cry of its occasion. Of course, that's a typically poetic way of putting it. Michael Hoffman talks about the 1950s. The values of the period, a kind of self-advertising cleverness, neatness, and smallness of scale and ambition, sanity, and levity, as if they were the same thing. Bullying superiority over subjects barely worth writing about, an easy relationship with the poem's own futility, an aspiration in some to the condition of trifles. It is these values that were overthrown by A. Alvarez in the introduction to his 1962 anthology, The New Poetry. Robert Lowell in the Paris Review says something very important and to the point. He says, there isn't any one way to write, but it seems to me we've gone into a sort of Alexandrian age. Poets of my generation, and particularly younger ones, have gotten terribly proficient at these forms. They write a very musical, difficult poem with tremendous skill. Perhaps there's never been such skill. Yet the writing seems divorced from the culture. It's because too much something specialized that it's become too much something specialized that can't handle experience. It's become a craft, purely a craft, and there must be some breakthrough back to life, said Robert Lowell in the Paris Review of 1961. So the generic 50s-ish writing, according to Michael Hoffman, in which the whole tenor and purpose of the poem are to mount a gesture of intricate refusal, instead of, as Helen Wendler put it, symbolically resolving the hard facts of life. So you have two poetic philosophies emerging from this great debate of the 50s. Is poetry marginal, and should it be only concerned with trifles, or is poetry intrinsic, and should it have as its mission that of moving the weight of the world? Well, it's all up to you. If you decide that you wish to investigate poetry, you have a whole lifetime in which to sort through its ins and outs. Translation, says Edward Hirsch, is a form of interpretation. In fact, what the stand-up comedian does, to a certain degree, is, in fact, confront and symbolically resolve the hard facts of life and translate them, interpret them in a humorous way for a wider audience. A poet is always a conceptualist rather than a colorist, says Joseph Brodsky. A conceptualist rather than a colorist. Poetry distinguishes itself from other literature by using all three modes of cognition: analytical, intuitive, and prophetic, all at once. Now, if you want an example of the analytical, look at, say, T.S. Eliot, and if you want the prophetic, William Blake is certainly the place to go. And if you want the intuitive, well, let's just say Elizabeth Bishop is as good a model of that as any. The more one reads poetry, the less tolerant one becomes of any sort of verbosity. Good style in prose is always hostage to the precision, speed, and laconic intensity of poetic diction. And for that matter, if you want to be a stand-up comedian, you could do worse than to take as your example the precision, speed, and laconic intensity of poetic diction. When Joseph Brodsky was investigated by Soviet interrogators in 1955 and 65 and accused of being a parasite, and they asked him where he learned how to write poetry, and he said, "I didn't think poetry was a matter of learning. I think it is a gift." Joseph Brodsky, who recently passed away, also said, "What dictates a poem is the language." And of course, that's a point that has been made time and time again about poetry, that it is the language. Well, I guess this about wraps it up for me. I suppose I have about another minute to go here. So I will wrap it up by stating something that was said about the late Joseph Brodsky. Joseph Brodsky was a sublimely unpsychological man, and his idealism consisted in the unreconstructed belief that the ideal is real, that the invisible is the proper prize for our dealings with the visible, that as our world moves from the high to the low, we must move from the low to the high and discover the blessing in being its instrument. He always prepared for the worst, and he saw comedy in pessimism's endless preparations. He combined pessimism about human nature with an optimism about human freedom in a way that made him a perfect American. And that is just about as perfect a close of this presentation as I could have thought of. And so, thank you for viewing part 8 of this course on comedy. Next week we'll be doing part 9, Black Humor and Satire. And in the week following, we will be talking about the comic novel and, of course, wrapping up the 10-week series. I'm the wrong hero in an uncommonly avuncular persona, and this is Cafe Cabaret. We are broadcast every Tuesday night at 9 p.m. Thanks for tuning in.